Thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and thanks for the organizers for their hard work. It's really a pleasure to be here and have the chance to discuss with you about a very interesting and also contentious topic such as vital normativity. Before I delve in, I would like to make two disclaimers. The first one is that this is rough work in progress, so I'm really open to receive all kind of feedback that you have about the arguments, the initial angle, and everything related to that. And the second of that is that this will be a more experimental talk for me, which can pay off or not. So I usually, as Sebastian said, wear the hat of a historian and philosopher of biology, but I will leave that aside and wear another hat, which I'm not that comfortable with, and which is the hat of an analytic philosopher, to my dismay or the dismay of some of the people here. So I will ask you to please bear with me. I will use a lot of the analytic lingo and their fondness for specific, distinctions, but maybe some interesting will come out of it, and we can discuss at the end if this approach is useful or not. All right, so I'll just start with the talk. In recent years, the agential status of non-human organisms has become a heavily debated subject across different areas of scientific and philosophical research. In fields such as the philosophy of biology, the philosophy of mind, and the cognitive sciences, and the philosophy of action, we have seen the emergence of burgeoning disputes, with positions both against and in favor of deeming non-human organisms as bona fide agents that pursue intrinsic goals as they carry on with their ways of life. For many scholars, countenouncing the agency of organisms across the phylogenetic board as entities capable of performing goal-directed actions is inextricably paired with another decentering move, to stop considering normativity as a distinctively human phenomenon. Normativity, in the traditional sense studied, for example, by ethicists, is related to how we designate and establish standards for judging and evaluating whether actions, attitudes, state of affairs, or outcomes are good, bad, desirable, permissible, and like, or even whether there are actions one ought to do in particular social settings or mental states one ought to be in given certain circumstances. Normativity, of course, is not the sole province of moral considerations. For some scholars, given that we use concepts and navigate a socially shaped space of reasons, our lives are inescapably normative by the discursive practices we engage in, which are inferentially articulated and bind ourselves and other participants to norm and deontic statuses. In contrast, normativity in supposedly less demanding biological context is related to organismal norms, that is, standards of possible performance that are adequate to fulfill the imminent goals of organisms such as surviving or reproducing. This line of reasoning comes to the surface in assertions such as Tyler Burgess. Wherever there is teleology, that is, wherever there is function or purposiveness, there are standards for realizing the function or the end state of the purposiveness. For many authors, then, organismal actions are carried out to satisfy or in accordance with specific norms. Normativity is thus deeply tied with organismal agency, or so it is claimed. But what is the nature of vital normativity? How may normative judgments about what organisms do or don't do be backed or defended? What is the meaning, if any, of normative concepts such as value or norms when dealing with non-human organisms? How could norms be connected to what organisms do or refrain from doing throughout their ontogenies? How could we even start answering these questions? When similar ontological, epistemological, or semantic problems are raised about human moral normativity, a helpful, consolidated philosophical lens that is usually adopted to try to sketch some answers is metaethics. In contrast, when it comes to vital normativity, neither the philosophy of biology nor the philosophy of the cognitive sciences, to mention just two central fields currently engaged with these debates, espouses explicit metaphilosophical perspectives. So, to counteract this gap in this talk, I take initial steps to mine a wide-ranging conceptual space of possible positions on vital normativity from a metaphilosophical vantage point. My intention is to draw parallels with metaethical debates, but importantly, without positing equivalence between moral and vital normativity, only a convergent meta-theoretical structuring of positions about them. What's important to note here is that metaethics is sometimes understood as a second-order discourse about first-order moral discourse. Doing metaethics involves taking a step back from particular substantive debates about the moral realm to spell out and reflect on the views, assumptions, and commitments that are adopted by those who engage in first-order moral thought, talk, and practice without necessarily taking a particular stand on substantive issues or vindicating certain tenets about morality. In a similar vein, I will attempt to articulate a second-order discourse on vital normativity, peering into possible views, assumptions, and commitments of scholars that are waging the debate at a first-order level of discourse, and without trying to appoint which precious position or underlying metaphysics is the right one. So to pursue this initial metaphilosophical analysis, today I'll start by outlining the divide between vital normativity realism and anti-realism. This includes spelling out a distinction between cognitivist and non-cognitivist positions about the truth aptness of normative concerning organismal activities, introducing the possibility of an error theory for vital normativity, and differentiating between conceptualist and objectualist commitments about normative facts and the instantiation of normative properties and state of affairs. After that, I'll delve into normativity realism by sketching non-naturalist and naturalist positions. I will argue that when the naturalization of organismal normativity is posited, the naturalist still has to offer a rejoinder to a modified version of G. Moore's open question argument regarding the equivalence of normative and non-normative concepts when the latter are used to account for the emergence or the identity of the former. And finally, I will present very briefly the metaphilosophical space and provide closing reflections on this exercise. So we can begin by introducing two overarching metaphysical standpoints about normativity, realism and anti-realism. The most common way to characterize the rift between moral normative realism and anti-realism is to say that it concerns the existence or non-existence of objective, observer-independent moral properties, facts, or truths. Moral realists are committed to the existence and objectivity of moral properties and facts without direct participation of moral statements. Moral realists of moral properties and facts without direct participation of human judgment, or at least to the objective truth or falsity of moral statements. That is, the idea that moral sentences are truth apt, while ranting that some of them are actually true. Moral facts, in this view, deal with real objects and events whose existence and nature are largely taken to be independent of our theorizing. In contrast, many moral anti-realists dispute the objective existence of morals, facts, or the truth of statements that appeal to moral properties and moral normativity more generally. Rejecting moral normative realism might imply, as Joy says, the denial that moral properties exist at all, or the acceptance that they do exist, but this existence is non-objective. In parallel, we could conceive two broad positions regarding the existence of objective, human independent normative properties, facts, or truths as regards to other organisms. Vital normativity realism and anti-realism. Vital normativity realists are those that endorse the existence and objectivity of normative properties or state of affairs involving, for example, goal-directed actions. For instance, natural norms as standards of behavioral performance. In a more minimal sense, realists would vouch for the general truth aptness of normative statements that refer to what organisms do or abstain from doing, and believe that a subset of these are indeed true. On the other side of the divide, vital normativity anti-realists would refuse to accept the objective existence of normative properties, facts, or truths that transact in the organismal terrain. For example, the actuality of vital norms. Another way of framing this would be to assert that there aren't normative truths about what organisms do or what life fundamentally entails that obtain independently of any preferred perspective on what vital normativity is assumed to be. That is, organismal normativity, if it exists at all, is tied to the judgment of human rational agents. Later, I will characterize with more detail the position of realism in their non-naturalist and naturalist orientations, but now I will go over potential varieties of vital normativity anti-realism in correspondence to those that have been pointed out in metaethics scholarship. Recall that discarding moral realism can be achieved by denying the existence of moral properties altogether, or two, accepting that these exist, but not in an objective, human-independent way. Joyce has recounted that there are two broad ways of endorsing one: moral non-cognitivism and moral error theory. Furthermore, proponents of two may be construed as moral non-objectivists. I contend that vital normativity anti-realism could also be reached by 1, rejecting the existence of any normative properties or processes in organisms, or accepting that some of these might exist, but not independently of the judgments and conceptual frameworks of humans interested in thinking about the lives of other organisms. Thus, organismal normativity anti-realism would also be the disjunction of 3 theses on organismal normativity: non-cognitivism, error theory, and non-objectivism. So let's analyze them in turn very briefly. Moral non-cognitivists contend that moral statements, for example, cheating in an exam is wrong and unethical behavior, do not have substantial truth conditions, and thus that they do not express propositions that could be true or false in any straightforward way. Instead, according to non-cognitivists, to advance a moral judgment is something akin to venting or feelings about its target, or expressing non-epistemic attitudes such as desires or sentiments of approval or disapproval, rather than articulating doxastic states of mind or stating facts about morality. For a non-cognitivist like Blackburn, for instance, the function of normative sentences is to avow attitudes, to persuade others, to insist on conformities and prescribe behavior. So when someone claims that cheating in an exam is wrong, they are simply expressing their disapproval on cheating in a regimented learning environment and intend to prescribe a different range of behaviors that would not end up in students cheating in an exam. When dealing with organisms, a non-cognitivist would deny that normative statements about organismal goal-directed actions are truth-apt. As an alternative, they would suggest that these statements merely express our attitudes and sentiments towards what organisms do or don't do. In a nutshell, non-cognitivists would disavow a referential semantics of truth-evaluable beliefs for normative terms as they pertain to organisms. Any judgments about, say, the appropriateness of an organismal response to fulfill a goal, for example, adjusting bodily constitution in response to a novel environmental condition in order to stay alive, would only express non-depictive states that belong to us humans, right? Such as our desires or preferences or emotions that could potentially orient our behavior or our attitudes towards non-human organisms. In metaethics, cognitivism stands in stark contrast to non-cognitivism by emphasizing that moral statements are truth-apt and that they express beliefs that can be accepted in a manner analogous to other statements with ordinary descriptive predicates. In a metaphilosophical exploration about vital normativity, a cognitivist position would stress that normative statements referring to living entities are truth-evaluable beliefs in a meaningful way. So, for example, take the following passage from what I take to be an organismal normative realist. Life imposes standards of action and discrimination, and those standards are to be complied with by the organism on pain of death. Insofar as the organism continues to live, it satisfies those norms. The organism distinguishes features of its environment into instrumental kinds and does so in general as it should distinguish those features. Organisms that continue to live do what they should on most occasions. The actions of organisms are, in general, in accord with the norms under which they stand. That is, in general, the actions of living organisms corroborate with what they should do. The actions corroborate with the norms of correct behavior and discrimination. When confronted with Ockrent's words, a cognitivist would stress that statements such as organisms that continue to live do what they should on most occasions, and the action of organisms are, in general, accord with the norms under which they stand, do have a truth value. They could either be true or false. Although most cognitivists are indeed realists, it is a mistake to assume that cognitivism ipso facto entails realism about normativity. For instance, scholars might agree that normative statements indeed express propositions and that their true valuable is somehow decidable, but they could still stress that all normative statements are uniformly bogus. This corresponds to the next stance. In metaethics, error theory, for a classical defense we have Mackey's famous book, in contrast to non-cognitivism, takes moral statements to express truth-evaluable propositions, but maintains that in moral discourse, all assertions are systematically false because there are no moral properties attributable to individuals or groups of individuals that would make them true. Error theorists are cognitivists, but they do not side with moral realists. For them, all propositions that imply or presuppose the instantiation of a moral normative property ultimately boil down to being untrue. Although error theory was originally formulated for moral discourse, in the last years, some scholars have tried to extend it to normative judgments in general. In the same direction, there could also be an error theory about the discourse surrounding organismal normativity. For instance, for an error theorist, occurrence assertions such as organisms that continue to live do what they should on most occasions, and the actions of organisms are, in general, in accord with the norms under which they stand, are in principle truth apt and truth evaluable, but are in the end false because there are no organismal norms and normative organismal properties whatsoever that would render them true. Some defenders of error theory argue that in the moral domain, although all basic moral claims are untrue, we should nevertheless retain our moral discourse, but with some modifications. And this revised discourse would be stripped of dubious metaphysical commitments and would embrace the non-doxastic and non-assertoric aspects of moral judgments. These error theories maintain that such a moral framework provides convenient, useful fictions that benefit societal life. Likewise, the general idea of vital normativity, an error theorist might argue, could still serve as a useful fiction for different epistemic communities of scientists, philosophers, of both, or whatever. Moving forward, Rosen has argued that discarding non-cognitivism in error theory would be conducive to supporting minimal moral realism. However, a robust moral realism would also require asserting the objectivity of moral facts in addition to this. So along these lines, a path towards minimal vital normativity realism could be achieved if we provide reasons to dispute non-cognitivism and error theory. Nonetheless, we would still need to go the extra mile to argue in favor of the objective existence of normative properties and facts in the organismal domain. In connection to this point, we can see what the third form of anti-realism hinges on: non-objectivism. According to Joyce, moral non-objectivism denotes the view that moral facts exist, but are mind-dependent in the relevant sense, while moral objectivism holds that they exist, but are mind-independent. So the heavy lifting then rests on what exactly mind-dependence or mind-independence means in this context. For some authors, this is a complication that makes the gulf between moral realism and anti-realism less clear-cut. It goes without saying that it is not my mission to sort out this complex issue here. With respect to organisms, a form of non-objectivism would hold that normative facts exist, albeit in a mind-dependent way, that is, without the objective existence of normative properties or states of affairs. The objectivist and non-objectivist distinction has also been drawn outside of the domain of moral normativity. Cobb and Morton have suggested a division that applies to normativity in general: objectualism and conceptualism. Objectualists argue that normative properties are actual, that is, non-conceptual features of the world. Conceptualists, on the other hand, as their name implies, confine normativity to the realm of conceptual thought. They contend that exclusively, or concepts or propositions can be genuinely normative. While both camps acknowledge the existence of normative truths, they fundamentally disagree on where these truths reside, that is, in the state of affairs of the world or in our conceptual constructions about the world. For some authors, conceptualism should be classified as a form of minimal normative realism. Cobb and Morton say, and I quote, "Realist normative conceptualism holds that normativity is a feature of some of our ways of thinking of certain properties and state of affairs rather than being a property of those properties and state of affairs themselves. Realist normative conceptualism is a form, at least, of basic normative realism, since it holds that normative judgments represents worldly states of affairs that are the truth conditions and that normative concepts are concepts of worldly properties. What it denies is that these states of affairs and properties are themselves normative." So a conceptualist position about organismal normativity would stress that this form of normativity is only present in the concepts, the theories, the models that we as human cognizers furnish to try to understand living processes. It would acknowledge that normative judgments about what organisms do represent or try to represent worldly states of affairs that stand in for the truth conditions, but disagree that these states of affairs and organismal properties are eo ipso normative. Only our concepts would be normative, not what organisms do or how organisms act in putative pursuance of goals and in interaction with their environments. Now, many philosophers of the life and cognitive sciences invested in the current debate on organismal agency would probably be dissatisfied with a conceptualist position qua realism about organismal normativity. They would likely agree in their search for something closer to objectualism, right? If normative properties exist in any natural system, these would be the properties of the agent. In this view, normative properties and processes, for example, norms, are grounded in what organisms have evolved to be and do, and thus are taken to be actual features of them, embedded in contexts that have nothing or little to do with the abstract philosophical musings of few representatives of the species Homo sapiens. For this reason, I now want to expand further the space of positions that could yield a robust vital normativity realism from both non-naturalist and naturalist standpoints. As we saw, non-objectivists and conceptualists about normativity can consider that normative truths, claims, and judgments and concepts exist, right? The point of contention with robust normativity realists is the existence of normative properties and states of affairs that are mind or concept independent somehow. So a central question for realists is how to account for the existence of said normative properties. Are organismal norms part of the furniture of the world, and thus can they fall within or fit the investigative purview of the natural sciences? Facing this quandary, we could identify two kinds of responses. Those that resort to non-naturalist explanancia and grounding options, and those that try to keep their answers within what's acceptable for the sciences by citing only, for instance, natural properties. We can start with the non-naturalist rejoinders. In an epistemological sense, non-naturalism in metaethics has been interpreted as a thesis that claims that knowledge about moral judgments is, in a way, self-evident, readily available to us through intuitive inferences and immediate awareness. After all, we are said to be thoroughly normative creatures, and we surely know when a normative issue is at stake, some would claim. This non-naturalist position is sometimes called intuitionism. Imaginably, one could also adopt an intuitionist stance regarding organismal normativity. We know that the normative judgments we make about other organisms are correct, for example, of a specimen of Octopus maorum in its struggle for existence, because we can intuit it clearly based on our immediate awareness of how organismal activities proceed. This is similar, although not identical, to the so-called Jonasian inference regarding organismal teleology that has permeated into some branches of enactivism. That is, the idea that we are entitled, based on our first-person experience of human teleology, to take the appearance of teleology in other living beings at face value. Some scholars have criticized enactivism's reliance on Jonas' philosophical biology as an anthropomorphic, anthropocentric, and anti-lateralist move that runs counter to the commitments of modern science, while others have defended and cheered on the value of adopting a phenomenological perspective of our basic experience of aliveness for moving the enactivist agenda forward. Again, I don't plan to adjudicate this controversy here. I just want to point out that if one of us thought that as a form of intuitionism was a reasonable approach, one could easily make a similar argumentative move to the Jonasian inference, but for organismal normativity in particular. We could infer the presence of normativity in other living beings based on our first-person experience of our normativity. Intuitionism is not the only formulation of non-naturalism that I want to carve out. Most often than not, non-naturalism in metaethics is assumed to be a metaphysical position that stresses that moral properties exist and are not identical with or reducible to any natural property. A realist position that highlights the existence of normative properties is known as primitivism. However, this camp holds that the nature of normativity cannot be fully explained. There is no correct constitutive explanation of normativity. We might express their view by saying that for them, normativity is primitive. It is unanalyzable. Primitivists generally fall into the trenches of non-naturalism, believing that normative properties are fundamentally, metaphysically different from natural ones and cannot be decomposed. It is conceivable that some scholars might adopt a primitivist stance regarding organismal normative properties. They would argue that these properties are fundamental, non-decomposable, and unanalyzable, forming the basic building blocks of normative discourse and thought about organismal activities and doings. Now, for many scholars, a particular corollary of non-naturalism in metaethics is the view that moral philosophy and ethics are autonomous from the natural sciences and their epistemic import. Non-naturalists about organismal normativity could also try to contend that their considerations on the topic may be informed by, say, the life and cognitive sciences, but they ultimately belong to an autonomous space of theorization that cannot be reduced to what our best sciences offer us. This could be, I think, a motivation for people thinking along these lines. Now, what about the option of presenting naturalized accounts of organismal normativity that are not detached from the scientific realm and prove compatible or try to prove compatible with other successful explanations of natural phenomena? In the domain of metaethics, robust normative naturalists are moral realists that hold that moral normative facts are natural facts, that normative predicates ascribe or refer to natural properties, and that all of these are stance independent. For some authors, this form of naturalism should also be accompanied by a methodological desideratum. We must try to learn and know about moral facts in the same way that we know about claims in the natural sciences. Usually, naturalists regarding organismal normativity are realists that hold that organismal normative facts are natural facts, that normative predicates ascribe or refer to certain natural properties of an organism which can be uncovered through the methods and explanations of the natural sciences, and that all of these are stance independent. While so far I've been drawing attention to intriguing parallels between metaethical positions and potential stances on organismal normativity, it is important to note that the naturalist positions related to both moral and organismal normativity are quite sui generis. The parallels between them may well reach their limits in this particular region of the metaphilosophical space. The metaethical domain provides a good illustration of a sort of unique, heterogeneous diversity. Various authors have employed a wide range of explanantia or grounding options to attempt to naturalize normative facts and properties. Some appeal to motivations, while others turn to desire-based reasons or practical agency. Self-legislation, categorical requirements, and practices pertaining to problems of normative governance have also been invoked. Still others have looked to natural functions or constitutive features of agency or action, drawing heavily from the philosophy of action literature. However, I don't intend to dig into all of these different approaches. I have a sort of reluctance stemming from the belief that they might not illuminate how best to naturalize organismal agency. In the future, I would like to develop a full-fledged taxonomy of naturalistic positions within the philosophy of biology and the philosophy of the cognitive sciences, helping to make explicit their assumptions and metaphilosophical commitments, which they all have. Alas, I will not undertake that project here. Instead, I will restrict myself to make some general remarks about naturalization projects and point out some challenges facing those of us who would like to call ourselves naturalists of some sort for organismal normativity. The first remark that I would like to make is that in the current debate on organismal agency, at least in the philosophy of biology, which is the field that I know better, everyone seems to assume that having a good theory of agency gives you ipso facto a good grounding for normativity. But I don't think this is necessarily the case. The normative does not come for free, so to speak, after you get agency, say, as a capacity of a system to perform goal-directed activities. One needs to specify how we go from naturalized conception of agency, which are a challenge in themselves, to normativity. And this is not something that gets transported or earned automatically. In the philosophy of action, for instance, some authors claim that normativity cannot be grounded in what is constitutive of action, that we need to add extra ingredients to get normativity. So, not all accounts in the philosophy of agency, in the philosophy of biology, make explicit the link between organismal agency and normativity. For instance, we have the otherwise very interesting ecological account of people like Dennis Walsh and Fermin Fulda, or the field theory from Dan McShee and Gunnar Babcock, but they don't take much time to explain how do we get normativity from something like agency. In contrast, if we look into the wide literature on biological functions, we can find explicit links to how some forms of normativity obtain. But among those that discuss organismal agency and not the teleology of parts, autonomy theory is one of the few accounts that has a more or less explicit position on the issue. And another is, of course, enactivism, but in another domain, and I will focus on autonomy theory very briefly to make some general remarks. So I am sure you're all familiar with this and probably know it way better than I do, but it is worth remembering some things, right? So within the autonomy framework, biological organization is buttressed by a teleological causal regime. Central to their argument is the linkage between organization and teleology through the concept of self-determination, or at least for Mosio and Bich. They assert that biological organization achieves self-determination by actively contributing to the determination of its own conditions of existence. That's an important bit. For Mosio and Bich, self-determination entails a circular relation between causes and effects, wherein organismal organization generates effects which in turn contribute to the maintenance of the organization. And they link this view of circular self-determination to intrinsic purposiveness and internal teleology. Now, in this view, circular causation is necessary but not sufficient for intrinsic teleology. Self-constraint in the form of organizational closure is also a necessary criterion for a system to enact a self-determining teleological regime. Mosio and Big mentioned that not all circular causal regimes embody self-determination. Rather, self-determination in the context of biological systems is specifically manifested as self-constraint, right? And this takes the form of a network of mutually dependent constitutive constraints that operate to sustain the system. Now, biological organization in this view can be grasped as a causal regime where a collection of structures serving as constraints for biological processes at different scales create a sort of reciprocal interdependence, organizational closure. Particularly, what sets organisms apart from other natural systems is that they exhibit closure of constraints. This entails the emergence of a second-order emergent causal regime where the individual constituents, functions as constraints themselves, launch a reciprocal interdependence. And this interprets allows the system to sustain itself and maintain its integrity collectively through self-determination, right? Now, autonomist asserts that closure furnishes a foundation rooted in scientifically valid, naturalistic principles for demystifying teleology. And in that wise, self-constraint implies that the circular organization specifies its own dynamics. That is why self-constraints involve self-determination and why biological organization, by realizing closure, is teleological. This is for sure a quite sophisticated and theoretically rich naturalistic position. But I want to argue that whenever the naturalization of vital normativity is countenanced, the naturalist still has to offer a rejoinder to a modified version of G. Moore's open question argument regarding the equivalence of normative and non-normative concepts when the latter are used to account for the emergence of the former. In the Principia Ethica, Moore told us that for any analysis of moral concept M, say goodness, in terms of a natural concept N, let's say pleasurableness, although Moore uses the example of desire to desire, which is very complicated. Yeah, so someone who fully grasped and understood the relevant concepts could still grant that something is N, but wonder whether it is M. For example, a speaker competent with the concepts involved could sincerely wonder, this is pleasurable, but is it good? Or if we define badness in terms of painfulness, this is painful, but is it bad? Such questions would not be open to competent speakers if M could completely be analyzed in terms of N. These questions are not meaningless, but rather remain open. If successful, this argument tells us something puzzling or interesting, if you will, about moral concepts, that they cannot be reduced to natural ones. But it does not automatically tell us anything about moral metaphysics. It is entirely possible that while the concept good cannot be reduced to the concept of pleasurableness, the property of goodness, if there is such a property, can be reduced to the property of pleasurableness. So there could be indeed metaphysical equivalence, but we will still need two different concepts for the same phenomena, right? So I argue that we could generalize more open question arguments to encompass, all normative concepts, including those that are related to organismal normativity. In this sense, we can start with the case of a normative concept, for example, organismal norms or whatever, which can be analyzed in terms of natural concept and prime, organizational closure, closure of constraints, whatever. But anyone could grant that something is N prime, but still wonder what it is N. For example, faced with organisms or organismal processes, someone might say, yeah, this is indeed closure of constraints, and it's very interesting and exploratory useful, but is it normative? This is not a meaningless question, but an open one. And it is an open one to the extent up to which we can already find articles precisely criticizing the purported normative force that stem from the natural concepts used within autonomy theory. For instance, Luca Corti has provided a critique of the organizational approach account of normativity. Right? This approach contends that because an organizationally closed self-determining system provides its own conditions of existence, and because it would cease to exist if its components didn't function properly, there is a direct link between these conditions of existence and normative claims. This argument typically takes the form of a counterfactual. If the system doesn't behave in a specified way, it would cease to exist. Therefore, it ought to behave in that way. However, Corti critiques this strategy, arguing that the link between conditions of existence and normative claims is not as straightforward as proponents suggest. Corti contends that while organisms do have specific objective conditions of existence due to their organizational closures, these conditions do not inherently justify normative ascriptions. Corti argues that although organisms do have a closed, self-constrained organization, this does not necessarily make them normatively special or imply that normative properties can be directly derived from their organizational structure. For Corti, if we assume that a counterfactual premise such as the one that is mobilized by autonomy proponents is accepted as a good way to derive normative assumptions, we should have to derive normative implications for many, many scenarios when we use counterfactual arguments like this. Again, it is not my role here to adjudicate if Corti is right or misses the mark with his critique. I simply want to show that all naturalist approaches regarding vital normativity will face the skepticism of a form of more open question argument, and that naturalists should be willing to argue back and respond to an objection of this sort, hopefully in good faith and strengthening their cases instead of dismissing them outright. So how am I doing with time?
You have approximately 10 minutes.
Ella said that less. If I have...
We started a little later, so approximately like a week, 10 minutes.
Okay. I'm about to finish, so we can also cut it short and then move on directly to the discussion, right? So I try to present today here the usefulness of adopting a metaphilosophical perspective to try to understand the conceptual space regarding vital normativity, right? We could summarize it in a diagram of this sort, right? On the one hand, we have something like anti-realism that could be, separated into error theory, non-cognitivism, and non-objectivism. And on the other hand, we would have two forms of realism: a minimal realism tied to conceptualist standpoints, and a and a robust realism, which could also branch out into naturalist and non-naturalist positions, right? I presented two examples of non-naturalist positions, intuitionism and primitivism, and I said that we still need to chart the terrain for naturalist positions about vital normativity, right? Now, this is of course one potential space, an incomplete space, right? Maybe if we don't start with the premises of analytic philosophy, believing that metaethics should be structured as it is, we could derive to another type of space. I'm open to that. I actually think that we should, and this is a way where we can start talking to one another. So I think that one of the main take-home messages is that for all of us who care about vital normativity, or if you want to call it simply organismal normativity to get away with the connotations of the vital, being aware of where we fall in the metaphilosophical spectrum is important to start engaging in productive discussions and not talk past one another. All of us here in this room and outside have meta-theoretical commitments, meta-philosophical positions that affect how we're going to argue, what we're going to find important, and what the limits of our positions going to be, and the sort of questions that we want to answer. So if we not start from a meta-philosophical position, I think the debate can get modeled very easily. So this is why I believe it is an important exercise to do. Now, we could also, from a metaphilosophical perspective, contend that perhaps these hard, steadfast dichotomies are not so. And for instance, we could think that instead of a dichotomy between objectualism and conceptualism, we could have a spectrum of different positions lying in between, right? Something at the center could be like perspectival agentialism, right? In the sense that, yeah, normative facts could be natural facts, but they are dependent on an agent having a perspective to the world, right? This could be a way. I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, right? And precisely in opening up the spectrum, here I think is where continental sources, analytic sources can enter into a fruitful dialogue, right? To try to understand how can we open the metaphilosophical space about vital normativity. And again, these sort of positions could then feed back into debates into metaethics, right? People don't usually countenance the possibility of having in-between scenarios between objectualism and conceptualism in metaethics. Why not? So this could be another case where what we learn about organismal normativity or trying to grapple our heads about organismal normativity can also help in other domains where normativity is at stake, for example, moral philosophy, right? So I hope to have convinced you that at least this exercise is useful. So I would like to end on a shameful note. making some promotion to a book that is about to come out that I edited with my colleagues Jan Bethke, Guido Prieto, and Gregory Radic, called The Riddle of Organismal Agency. And we have very interesting contributions. If you're interested, the book will come out in 2 days in a printed form, and it's already out online. So if you want, I can send you a copy as well. So without more on this note, thank you very much for listening, and I would love to hear your thoughts and questions.
Okay, so let's start the discussion, around 15 minutes. Charles has his hand up first, and Rudy.
Yes, Charles. Thanks a lot, Alejandro, and I genuinely appreciate this sort of creating a discussion space or putting down some parameters or protocols for a discussion space. Sincere appreciation. And so, perhaps, indeed, populating that future discussion space, there's this species of question which is like, I'm interested in X, or I know about X, and how does it fit in the story you've told? And it's not the most wonderful kind of question, but sometimes, you know, the rest of us sink to that level. And I have been interested in the past in something that I horribly called at one point attitudinal vitalism. And it was describing something that I kind of pulled out of Goldstein a little bit and Comey and more, where I'm not even sure if the word attitude was explicitly there. I think even the word attitude was my way of summarizing what they were saying. But it was that idea that as opposed to a kind of naive, let's say objectivist, realist, life is X, the properties of life are X, and life and non-life is sort of objective distinction, that this idea of attitude had a very strong existential dimension. So that organisms exist and that the way they exist is somehow a basic part of their definition. And I never did very much with it. I just sort of thought, oh, this is nice because there's something, so now I'm using some of your terminology, but something realist about it, and yet it's existential. So it's not like saying metabolism is the fundamental feature of X, or milieu intérieur is the fundamental feature, you know? So the question, like I said, the boring kind of question is, where does it fit? Because you have a lot of subtle contrasts. Yes, it's not realist. Is it cognitivist or not? Et cetera, et cetera. So A, does it fit? B, is it interesting? Does it add anything or not? Or because indeed, you very nicely built this out of analytic materials, as you said, whereas this existential vitalism was a kind of obscure corner of the continental arena. So,
yeah. No, thank you, Charles, for the question and the input. So, in the analytic metaethical discourse, attitudes usually fall in the terrain of non-cognitivism. Right? So they think that there is no truth happiness about normative judgments, but when we make a moral judgment, we are expressing a sort of attitudes about the object that we want to countenance. This could be a way of trying to fit attitudinal vitalism here, but I think that you're getting at something that does not fit, neatly with what non-cognitivist or the non-cognitivist argument would say. So I think probably what you say is more in between a sort of minimal realism and robust realism, or at least authors would like it so. This is another possibility. Perhaps the case is that even though they want to be in the realist side, they should be considered anti-realist in a way, right? Because they are not necessarily positing the objective, stance-independent existence of normative states of affairs. So even though another possibility would be to say that even though they want to be realist, they are not really so because of this metaphysical commitment that they are not willing to take on board. Right? This would be my response to how one could frame attitudinal vitalism in this way, right? To either put it in between or say that it's actually over there, and if you want to go here, just bite the bullet and come.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Excellent.
Yeah, so thanks. This was great. This is really useful for my thinking. I didn't understand that open question argument, and that's not your presentation, that's my ignorance. So I wondered if you could explain it to me a little more. I mean, if you are a living system, then you have certain actions that are conducive to survival and some that are not. So this implies directly whether an action is good or not. And of course, I think the problem is not that the good or bad, the fact that that there's normativity sticking to those actions, but the fact is that the outcome, of course, is never clear. So it's a vague notion before. It's only something you can judge in retrospect. You're always wiser. Hindsight is always 20/20, and you can't know in advance whether you do something is actually a good thing to do in a situation or not. So I think, for me, that's more the problem than the more abstract question whether there is normativity in an action, because there is, even if you don't know whether it is good or bad, there is a norm attached to it, at least, subjectively you think as a human being, or you have evolved to, as a bacterium, to act this way because either your ancestors acted in this way and it was good, or because you think it's a good thing to do.
Right, so what I wanted to do by presenting the open question argument is just to say that if you're going to be a naturalist, there will be people that will come with something like this, right? And they will say the normative force or the normative entailment of possibly something like, I don't know, organizational closure. I don't see it. Where is it? And then you will have to make a stronger case to try to convince or try to show where is that entailment, right? Because people like Corti would simply say, yes, counterfactually, the living system should have done this, and it did so, it survived. It did so, but where is the normativity? So they would still not be convinced that we can describe the normative using natural properties.
Right, okay. So do you think the way I posed the question was convincing or not?
Well, for me, how you were framing the question is for me trying to convince you that the open question argument is a good argument, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that. I try to be like detached. Like if we take a metaphilosophical perspectives, this would be a response to the naturalist, right?
I was trying to understand the argument itself.
Yeah. So clearly, a naturalist can choose to debunk the open question argument, as many people have done so in moral philosophy, or try to say like, oh well, this says something interesting, because really, we will always need normative concepts. We cannot really supplant them with natural ones, right? Metaphysically, it could be the same thing, but we still need these two conceptual spaces. This is one of the important corollaries of the open question argument, even though if you're not convinced of the anti-realist implications that for someone like Moore it had, right?
Yeah, so that's a follow-up I have. Is why is thinking that both of these aspects are real and anti-realist stance? Because I'm thinking, so in my work I come across Joseph Weizenbaum a lot, who in the context of AI is arguing that there are things that are computation and there are things that are judgment. They're different, fundamentally different, but they're both real. And this is why you can't calculate the world, okay? So computation is a model of how humans calculate, but you can't explain the world by calculation, because judgment is a fundamentally different thing, but it's equally real. Does that make any sense?
That could also be somewhere falling between primitivism or something like this. Not necessarily in the non-naturalism. There are authors that say like, well, we could also be primitivist about normative properties by saying that they are related to the natural, but we can still be. They are different, qualitatively different from others. So we cannot reduce them, right?
Well, they're not unexplainable. They're just not explainable in terms of what certain people think is the only way to explain things.
Yeah. So your position would perhaps need another different stance to try to kind of get to the grips of the problem of making this differentiation between computation and non-computation.
Okay.
So I don't think it necessarily fits there, but primitivists would perhaps say like, oh, you're actually a primitivist, but
it sounded like voodoo to me, so I hope I'm not a primitivist.
It's not my job.
I know, I'm not blaming you. Thanks. So again, this was really, really useful. Thank you.
No, thanks.
Are you writing this up?
Trying to, very early stages.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question. Yes.
Yeah, so equally, thanks a lot for all this ordering. And you put intuitionism into the blue bubble, into the pink bubble, which is in the blue bubble. So is it a variation of cognitivism for you? Because I would actually put it at least as well into the non-cognitivism surrounding Big Bubble. And if I understand Jonas well, it is not cognitivist. That's the famous Jonas twist, you know, when you need yourself as living existential body to do this, to know that life is saying yes to itself. So it's not cognitivist, actually, I would say.
Okay.
And I mean, this might be, I mean, that's my opinion. You can range it differently, but this might explain some of the discussion which you refer to about Jonas. That if you take him as a cognitivist, then of course it's anthropocentric.
Oh, thank you. This is actually very, very, very useful to me. I'm not a Jonas expert, so I saw some resemblance between intuitionism and the humanism. In fairness, I did claim that it's not the same, but I see some similarities. But maybe you're right. Maybe this should not fall within the camp of the cognitivists that believe in the truth aptness of normative statements, and should be then another form of non-cognitivism.
Yeah, because he would actually say that he is a realist, of course.
Exactly.
That
but
makes it interesting.
That makes it interesting because for this sort of analytical ordering, to be a realist, you need to be a cognitivist.
Yes.
So this would be another route to try to get a reach at realism without passing cognitivism. So this is also the kind of dynamics that I told you that I said that could be interesting to see if we come from different philosophical backgrounds and we try to put, then maybe this sort of scheme needs to be retweaked. So I thank you for the feedback, and I will have to read more closely, Jonas.
Yeah, thanks for your answer. Yes.
Okay, I think that we can we have a very short question.
I think mine is very short.
Okay, then it should be really short.
It's sort of, maybe it's a naive question because I really don't really metaethics and philosophy, but yeah, also wondering in a similar line about why cognitism is the only realist position here. And also, so what exactly do philosophers mean by cognitism here? Because you made some examples so the cognitism entails that, let's say, cheating is wrong, it has a sort of proposition that this has a clear effect. But then what about saying it's important to a certain agent that something is to be done? So here, what about individual perspectives?
Yeah.
So how would you account for that? Because to me, intuitively, it seems that, of course, you can also be a realist about individual perspectives. You say it's not universally true that cheating is wrong, but it's normative fact that somebody is very much interested in, I mean, not interested, but you know what I'm saying. Somebody thinks this to be the case, that cheating is wrong. There are no universals about it.
The reason that metaethicists care about this is because of the entailment of having individual perspective, agent based on normativity, right? For many people, this would mean some form of moral relativism, and this is something that they cannot take on board. So that's why there is this strong universalist tendency in metaethics to either have strong realist positions or strong anti-realist positions. But of course, I said that if we think about organism normativity, clearly we can be some sort of realists by taking a perspectival approach, right? And in that sense, this would be a form of realism that is not necessarily cognitivist, or is cognitivist in the sense that it requires the specification of, for agent A, it is a right action. It was in its own, for its own sake, or something like this, right?
Because from what I'm familiar with in the British, let's say, nationalizing norms, most of those accounts, I think, fall into a relativist perspective in some sense. Like, you have different organisms, and those organisms are very value different things, like different values. So in this sense, there's no real cognitive.
Yes, and I think that's why also this parallelism cannot be complete or isomorphic. There are clearly some specificities for thinking about organism normativity, but there are also some common positions, right? We are using the term normativity as applying equally in a way to all these domains. So what's common could also be uncovered by this position, but at the same time, starting from the metaethical perspective limits the space of possibilities in a way that you mentioned. Yeah.
Okay, we'll wrap this up. So.